Concept assembly line, where ideas get to work. The United States federal government operates under a distinct advantage. It is the sole issuer of the US dollar. Unlike households, businesses, or state governments, it must spend before it taxes and never runs out of money in its own currency. It does not need to raise funds in any conventional sense. It creates them. This is the defining feature of monetary sovereignty. State governments, however, do not share this power. They are just currency users. To spend, they must first tax or borrow dollars. Dollars they cannot issue themselves. This places them in a precarious position, particularly in moments of crisis. While the federal government can run deficits indefinitely without solvency risk, state budgets must balance over time or face insolvency. What might seem like an abstract accounting distinction becomes a matter of life and death when disaster strikes. The last time the world witnessed the dangers of stripping monetary sovereignty from crisis-prone governments, it wasn't in the United States. It was in Europe. In the wake of the 2008 financial crash, nations like Greece, Spain, and Italy found themselves locked into a shared currency, the euro, without the tools to manage their own recoveries. These countries could no longer issue their own money to fund stimulus, recovery, or even basic social services. Instead, they were at the mercy of the European Central Bank and the financial markets, forced to borrow at high interest and meet deficit targets regardless of the toll it took on their economies. As unemployment soared and public services collapsed, the prescription from Brussels was austerity, slashed budgets, pension cuts, tax hikes. The results were devastating. GDP fell, debt-to-GDP ratios rose despite the cuts, and entire generations were locked out of employment and stability. The Greek crisis, in particular, became a warning. Never force a government to behave like a household in the middle of an economic inferno. And yet, this is precisely what the Trump administration signaled when it proposed devolving FEMA responsibilities to the states. The logic was framed as responsible federalism, encouraging states to manage their own disaster recovery budgets and take greater ownership of their emergencies. But this framing collapses under scrutiny. It attempts to impose sovereign responsibilities on entities that are not sovereign. The result is a structural mismatch between obligation and capacity. Imagine a future where a major hurricane levels a coastal city in Florida or a wildfire razes neighborhoods in California. If FEMA funding is curtailed or delayed under the assumption that states should manage recovery themselves, the options quickly narrow. States must either slash services elsewhere to redirect funds, raise taxes on a shell-shocked population, or issue debt, assuming they can find lenders willing to take the risk at a reasonable rate. But unlike the federal government, states face real constraints in the bond market. The worse the disaster, the weaker their credit becomes. It's tempting, especially in certain ideological circles, to equate local control with efficiency. If the federal government steps back, the argument goes, states will become leaner, more responsive, more innovative. But in reality, there is a vast difference between managing how a recovery unfolds and being responsible for funding whether it can unfold at all. Devolving FEMA without matching monetary authority is not empowerment, it's abdication. Local knowledge can and should inform disaster response strategies, but the funding of those strategies must come from the only entity that can operate without solvency risk, the federal government. Just as you would not ask a hospital to treat a trauma patient while also insisting it can't run a deficit, you cannot ask a state to manage a natural disaster without access to the monetary levers needed to respond at scale. As the climate crisis accelerates, the frequency and intensity of disasters is only expected to grow. Rising seas, extreme heat, and widespread wildfires are no longer distant threats. They are annual events. States like Louisiana, Texas, California, and Florida are already burdened with disaster response and infrastructure costs that exceed what their tax bases can support. The idea that these same states should now shoulder FEMA's responsibilities is not just economically unsound, it's morally negligent. The outcome of such a policy would be a domestic replay of Europe's austerity spiral. Debt-ridden states would cut services, delay recovery, and fall further behind. Economic migration would accelerate as people flee failing local economies. Bond markets would begin pricing in disaster risk, pushing up borrowing costs further. Wealthier states might scrape by. Poorer states, especially those hit hardest by climate events, could face structural decline. The federal government was never designed to merely referee a federation of equal players. Its strength lies in its capacity to absorb asymmetric shocks and coordinate collective responses. FEMA is not a handout. It is a recognition that some burdens must be pulled nationally because they are too great, too unpredictable, and too unequally distributed to manage locally. We have a choice. We can embrace the power of the currency we issue and use it to backstop recovery wherever it's needed. Or we can simulate the Eurozone's worst mistakes, forcing our states into a fiscal structure that punishes them for being part of a union they cannot leave and cannot finance. To recreate the structural trap of the Eurozone inside the United States is to ignore one of the clearest lessons of the last 2 decades. Currency users cannot operate like currency issuers, and governments that are responsible for large-scale public goods, like disaster response, must be equipped with monetary tools equal to the task. Shifting FEMA to the states may win points with those eager to cut federal spending on paper, but the real cost is delayed recovery, deeper inequality, and systemic risk to the most vulnerable regions in the country. Monetary sovereignty is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a practical necessity in the face of crisis, and it belongs, by design, to the federal government, not to 50 fractured and fiscally constrained states. We don't need to guess what happens when we ignore this truth. We already watched it unfold across the Atlantic. We called it the Euro crisis. If we let it play out here, it will have a different name, but the same tragic ending. Please subscribe to keep the content coming. It costs you nothing but makes all the difference.